Hello, everyone. I'm Neena Gopal. Welcome to Global Express. This is where we have a wide ranging discussion on events that impact India and the world. Today, all eyes are on the US President elect Donald Trump and the team he's putting together, signaling a hard line on China with his pick for National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio, both incidentally very pro India. It should come as no surprise to anyone that Afghanistan is missing from the US radar completely. Trump, in his earlier avatar, had set the exit in motion that his successor, Joe Biden, executed in the messiest fashion possible. But are we seeing India quietly making moves on a possible India Taliban rapprochement, if we can even call it that? Days after India's top foreign ministry official JP Singh's 48-hour visit to Kabul, where he met a string of top officials, including Defense Minister Mullah Muhammad Yaqub, the son of the founder of the Taliban movement, Mullah Omar, the Taliban regime has appointed a young Afghan student in Mumbai as its acting consul, Ikramuddin Kamil. This was announced by Taliban's deputy foreign minister, Sheikh Mohammed Abbas Tanadzion X. This is the Taliban government's first appointment in India after it took power on August 15, 2021. So it raises the big question, what's next? Will India reciprocate with a formal recognition of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan? And how do we label this move? Is it a strategic choice that India is making by completely overlooking the Taliban's shocking track record of gender discrimination against women and girls vis-a-vis their education, use of public transport, public spaces, education, and their brutal punishment meted out to women who challenge their writ? I mean, beaten, stoned to death. Delhi has understood that after 3 years of benign neglect by Washington, the clock is not going to be turned back. Trump's United States is not heading back to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not a priority. There are no US troops on the ground, no diplomatic personnel, no embassy. But India seems to have a strategic game in play. It seems to be making moves to close the deal, present the world with a fait accompli. Or is there a little more to it than meets the eye? Talking to us today are four experts from Afghanistan. Saad Mohseni is an Afghan-Australian national who launched this highly successful Tolo News and Tolo TV, the radio station Arman FM, all groundbreaking moves after the Taliban banned music. He's navigated both the Karzai and Ghani governments and the Taliban's re-entry, but has now left the country. I'm looking forward to reading your book, Mr. Mohseni, Radio Free Afghanistan, a 20-year odyssey for an independent voice in Afghanistan. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Also with us is Shanthie Mariet D'Souza, the founder and president of Mantraya Institute of Strategic Studies and visiting faculty in the Naval War College in Goa. Welcome, Mr. D'Souza. Sumeer Bhasin is an independent geopolitical analyst and Afghan expert, one of the early entrepreneurs who saw that violence unleashed by Pakistan's ISI firsthand when the Indian embassy in Kabul, that was right opposite his Anar Travels offices, was destroyed in a suicide bomb blast on July 7th, 2008. Welcome, Mr. Bhasin. And last but certainly not the least is the legendary Kathy Gannon, senior fellow, Media Center at Harvard Kennedy School, longtime foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, covering Afghanistan and Pakistan for over 35 years, wars in Lebanon, Iraq, Central Asia, Azerbaijan. She was attacked and wounded in Afghanistan. I hope you're better now, Kathy. Now based in Pakistan, she's director of the Associated Press. So let me start with you quickly, Ms. Gannon, because I know Saad Mohseni has to leave us in a little while. You've written recently about how during a recent presidential debate, Donald Trump spoke of his repeated conversations with Abdul when he was president, referring, of course, to Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, a vice president in the Taliban government. That conversation was about the US withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, part of the plan that US Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad set in motion. You've also gone on to say that Trump should look at an opportunity to at least explore ways that would allow the United States to return to Afghanistan without giving it diplomatic recognition. You say the US policy of isolation has been an abysmal failure. You say that the US embassy in Kabul and in Doha has been completely ineffective. So, would Trump be even open to reopening a US embassy in Kabul? I mean, can the US trust the Taliban in security, given how vulnerable they are to attacks? You've quoted a UN report as saying terror attacks are proliferating. Why would the Taliban, given its antipathy towards the US and the West, even go for something like that? Please unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. You're on mute.
Sorry,
Ah, yes,
sorry.
you're
Yeah.
on mute. Yeah.
Sorry. First, I'm no longer. I was the director for the AP in the region, but I'm not not any longer. A couple of things. First, there are several embassies, 17, I believe, who are currently open in Afghanistan that no one has given diplomatic recognition to the Taliban. Security-wise, the UN is there. The US Embassy has been in Kabul. Nobody has attacked the US Embassy. Nobody has taken over the US Embassy. What I'm really making the argument, and having been in Afghanistan during the Taliban's first term between 96 and 2001, and seeing the impact of the last 3 years of the US policy being exactly the same as what happened between 96 and 2001, which was they became increasingly isolated. Those who wanted to challenge the narrative of a small number in the leadership had no strength behind them. And so they didn't have an avenue through which to go to gain some traction. And there exists again in Kabul, among the Taliban, those who want to engage. I think to say that there's an antipathy toward the US and toward the West, I don't know that that is true of all of the Taliban.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It's not a monolith. And what I said was about proliferation of militant groups. The attacks in Afghanistan have largely been carried out, as far as can be determined, by the Islamic State. I said there's a proliferation of militant groups. That also occurred between 96 and 2001. And what I'm saying is that the US has to rethink its policy and find a way to engage in Afghanistan and be in Afghanistan, because while you're absolutely right about the restrictions on women, women are in the health ministry, women are in the education ministry, there are women on the street, there are women-run businesses. I don't say that it's good for women. It's not. It's absolutely not. And the edicts have proliferated and mostly directed at women. But the greater the isolation, the more the strength to those who benefit from isolation. And that's a certain fragment of the leadership, not the entire leadership. Anyway, that's it in a nutshell, because I know Saad has to leave and he has some very important comments to make.
So, to get a first-hand view of what it's like dealing with the Taliban when they took power in 2021 August, I'd like to bring you in, Mr. Saad Mohseni. You stayed on in Afghanistan after the Taliban's lightning strike, its takeover of Kabul, and how the Afghan army simply crumbled, melted away. You write in your book, Radio Free Afghanistan 20-Year Odyssey, of what it was like dealing with the Taliban. Did they give you a free hand? Did they allow women anchors on your news programs? Could you describe what it was like? You say that the Karzai and Ghani governments were pressured you as well. Why did you finally leave? What was the trigger?
Well, we haven't left. We still have an operation, and we still have 400 or 500 employees. So the number of people we have working for us is essentially the same. What's interesting is, at least for the news side, we have more women working for us now than we did pre-2021, simply because we've been more aggressive and active in terms of recruiting.
That's remarkable. That's remarkable.
Yes.
And the Taliban haven't objected to that?
Not yet. I mean, we, as Kathy pointed out, the situation on the ground is always a lot more nuanced than how it's reported outside. We have women in front of the camera. We have women behind the camera. We have women who go on the field and report from the major cities, perhaps not from the provinces, but relatively speaking, they are free to do their stories. They present programs, they talk on television. So it's, the difference being from, 2021, pre-August 2021, is that they have to cover their faces and they wear a surgical mask, a black surgical mask, to comply with the Taliban edicts that women need to cover their faces. Nonetheless,
Did
their
they make
presence is
your did they interfere on your news coverage? They actually say you can't run this, or you have to run it by them. Is there that
no.
kind of interference?
There's no censorship per se, but of course, any media organization, whether it's us 10 years ago or someone working for a major outlet in Europe, I mean, you do take into account not just the laws, but the relationships and so forth. So we obviously, on some issues which are very controversial, we need to take that into account, and perhaps we're not as aggressive as we would be if the Taliban were not in charge. So there are certain issues that we have to cover, with a great deal of care. And as much as we cover pretty much every major news story, including, UN reports on human rights violations and so forth, probably we don't cover them with as much fanfare and noise as we would have beforehand. In terms of entertainment, there's no music, there's no musical shows, there are no soap operas, including Indian soap operas, which were very popular. So yes, we have taken those sorts of programs out. Still, we have game shows, we have travel shows, we have chat shows. So if you turn on the television, it actually seems normal at the beginning, and then you see, of course, women covering their faces. But as Kathy pointed out, is that the movement is not a monolithic one. There are different identities and individuals within the movement themselves. Some are more pragmatic than others, and of course, it's they're young. The leadership is young. Mullah
How
Yaqub,
does
the
that
defense.
translate vis-a-vis the coverage of news when you say it's not monolithic and they have different viewpoints, in the sense, do they actually are they people who rain on your parade, or are they people who say no, go for it? I mean, is there an interaction?
Both. I mean, I think that with these new laws which were introduced, but yet to be implemented in terms of what can be covered on television, we've been summoned by different departments and told, no, please continue, and keep women on television, continue,
Oh,
while others have given speeches and said, no, this is not good enough. So you're seeing this sort of tug of war, not very obvious, and not it's not what you would see on the floor of the House of Representatives in the US, but it's still, you are seeing differences of opinion, and they're coming to the surface in terms of the different points of view, whether it's about media or girls' education or engagement with the world. And I think Kathy's right. I mean, there are two things you have to remember. Firstly, current policies have not worked. If the world intended to pressure the Taliban into, in terms of changing its policies vis-a-vis women and inclusivity of government and so forth, they have not worked. The second reality is that they're in charge and they're not really being challenged. People speculated 3 years ago that they will not last. That's not the case. So they're the only game in town. And I think it's, as Kathy pointed out, it's very important for the world to engage. Engagement doesn't mean recognition. Engagement means simply to sit and talk to them and to make them understand in terms of what the world expects, and what they should expect from the world. And there should be a roadmap of sorts that could lead to perhaps normalization once they abide by their commitments to the Afghan people, not because the international community demands it, but because the Afghans demand women's rights, girls for
oh,
education, inclusivity. This is what the majority of Afghans demand. And ironically, this is what the majority of the Taliban leadership also demands. And
is that so?
whether it's in interviews or in off-the-record discussions, they have insisted, I would say 60-70% of them, that girls need to go to school, for example. They're a little bit more defensive when it comes to a governing, an inclusive governing body. But there are people now, after 3 years, that they understand that in this today's world, that the way they govern needs to change. And the best thing for Afghanistan is if that change comes from within.
So, do you think that Afghanistan is on the path to becoming a slightly more inclusive society? Because, I mean, from what you're saying, is this schism between the Kandahar lobby, I mean, the Kandahar-based, Hibatullah Akhundzada and the Doha Council and, and Kabul? Because is that where these differences are, the old guard and the new? And do you see that as affecting relationships, going forward with the US? Will the US come round to, even looking at Kabul differently under Trump?
Well, I mean, I think they're very careful. Obviously, they don't talk about these divisions and they try to work together. And it's not that black and white. There are people in Kandahar who are more pragmatic, and there are people in Kabul who are more conservative than some of the younger leaders in the country. But what's important is that some of the key figures, some of the people that JP Singh met, for example, with, are more siding with the more progressive or more pragmatic side. And I think the ones who are very conservative and want to, obviously move slowly, some of them may also view like girls' education as a necessity, but are reluctant to do so because they also have their hardcore constituencies. So it's not that simple. And of course, they're concerned about ISIS and other groups who are more radical and more extreme than they
Yes,
are.
I was going to bring up that actually. The
Yeah.
fact that Afghanistan now seems to have become a base for terror groups, where once it was home to, terror groups that the Pakistan ISI groomed and nurtured. Now it seems to be a proliferation of all kinds of, it's a whole alphabet soup of, terror groups. Isn't that serious? Is that a serious threat to the region? I mean, particularly India?
Potentially. I mean, getting back to the US and engagement,
Mm.
first and foremost, I mean, of course, America has and the West has a moral obligation not to abandon Afghanistan. And Afghanistan in the 20 years where the international, and of course, along with India and China and Japan and so forth, were so active in terms of the development of the country. The changes that we saw in Afghanistan were transformative for the country. And you can't simply abandon the people of Afghanistan. It's important to engage simply for the sake of the 43 million inhabitants of this country. In terms of radical groups, I mean, if you were to believe, some of the experts, is that these groups are to a large extent contained. And even ISIS is perhaps weaker than it was, say, 12 months ago or 18 months ago. So there are grounds for the international community to engage with the Taliban on the issue of
So you're saying that they've
counterterrorism.
been weakened. They've been weakened by the Taliban. The Taliban has reduced their sort of movement.
I'm only quoting columnists like David Ignatius and others who have obviously have written on this issue because they have deep sources within the U.S. intelligence community, and other reports that we've seen that obviously the Taliban are, the Doha Agreement obligates them to ensure that these groups don't strike against Western and other interests from inside the country. So, but there are reasons for the Americans to engage. As to whether they engage or not is another thing. Of course, there's this issue of a moral obligation, but there's also the issue of narcotics, which could impact Europe. And the Taliban have been able to reduce obviously what's cultivated and exported from Afghanistan. The issue of terrorism, which remains a major challenge for the West. The issue of refugees. If Afghanistan is mired in another conflict, hundreds of thousands of people will not just end up in the neighborhood, but can also end up in Europe and beyond. And of course, regional stability, China and Iran and their influence in the region, and to limit that, I think would also interest Trump. Last but not least, Trump is a deal maker and a very transactional politician.
That's right.
The Afghan mining sector could be of interest to him as well. But it's too early, because if you look at the lineup of officials who've emerged, so far I can't see anyone who could champion the Afghan cause, except Mike Waltz, who's the national security advisor, who worked in the embassy in Kabul and has been involved in national security for some time, both in Afghanistan, but also in the White House, where he worked for Vice President Cheney.
So basically, we can take the promise made to JP Singh with a little more weight than we would have given, credence to it in the past few months. That terror will not be launched from Afghan soil on India. That's one point. The other thing I wanted to ask you is about Zalmay Khalilzad, Mr. Mohseni. Do you think he has a role to play at all in the future in Trump 2.0?
It remains to be seen because some people would refer to him as a neocon, and that may be an obstacle for him. But I suspect that people like Rubio could do with his expertise, not just on Afghanistan, but also the region. And he's worked in Washington for decades, and they have some young, obviously inexperienced operators, so they could do with his expertise. It's too early to say because he was actually quite close to Pompeo, so his champion at the in Washington is no longer in the running for anything really. In terms of India, I think India's only priority is to ensure that insurgents or armed groups are not using Afghanistan as a base to target India, which is unfortunate because India should be also concerned about its 80 plus years of ties with the Afghan people. And as far as I can see, India has completely neglected and abandoned its obligation to the Afghan people, from visas and so forth. And its only priority seems to be ensuring that it remains protected. And that relationship, and JP Singh is a good man, and he served in Afghanistan. We know him very well. But they only have one priority, which is to ensure that these groups don't end up in Kashmir and other parts of India.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohseni, for coming on the program. It's a pleasure. I should tap you again in the future when I bring up Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for
I,
having me.
I want to bring you in, Shanthie Mariet D'Souza, to get to the crux of why we're looking at Afghanistan this week. Basically, your commentary on JP Singh's visit to Kabul was quite fascinating. You said that it's part of India's pragmatic policy, doing business with the Taliban regime. And as Saad Mohseni has just told us, without giving it official recognition, it just sort of circumnavigates a very important issue, which is the human rights and what happens to women and so on and so forth. So is this a pragmatic Delhi now, choosing to rebuild ties with the 3-year-old government, which was very, very anti-Indian? Or is it, is it India basically, sort of trying to edge its way into creating let's say, an alliance with the Taliban, which is not going to make it very popular in the West either. And now the appointment of Kamil, he's a young Afghan student. I mean, it looks to me like it's one stop short of formal recognition. Is that on the cards, or you think that will be on hold?
I think, as I've written in the article, it's a pragmatic policy. And it's essential at this point of time, given that there are very little options available in Afghanistan. It's actually a dead end. So as you know, in the last 2 decades, India had supported the democratic regime there. But with the collapse which occurred in Kabul of that regime and the Taliban takeover, India had to move out of Afghanistan lock, stock and barrel. And what are the options India left with? So whenever you talk to the policy wonks in Delhi, it's like, what do we do in Afghanistan? And on the other hand, Taliban has been consistently making outreach to India to do more. So this
that's very interesting. You wrote that. What kind of outreach was that really? What have they been doing?
They want more assistance in terms of building institutions, helping them with the running of the state machinery, because they actually don't know how to run the state. But more importantly, even on the security and defense sector, they've been asking India to step in. And this is a very interesting scenario, because if you remember the last 2 decades, India shied away from getting involved militarily in Afghanistan. And at this moment,
putting boots on the ground, yes.
Yeah, except for the Indo-Tibetan
patrol.
Yeah, that is more for the security of the embassy and the consulates, but it was not a military footprint. So the Taliban have been making consistent outreach and they want India to step up. And given the difficult relationships the Taliban has with Pakistan now, I think they have learned this classic game of diplomacy of playing one against the other. So it's very
Have they?
interesting to see that as India steps in, it will be very uncomfortable for Pakistan. And it's working on the other way. If you look at the relationship between Taliban and Pakistan, it's been frayed at various levels, from the trade relationship to the security issues, the fact that the Afghan Taliban are supposedly giving sanctuary to the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, and the border issues between the two countries. So India stepping up to the plate looks like it's a pragmatic policy in a strategic sense, because it's found the space again to reinvent its footprint and expand its reach in Kabul. So, and that has been occurring, right from 2022. And consistently, there has been exchange of officials. The Taliban have been able to do some governance training programs with India. So there is that linkage which is being developed. And now it's a scenario where most of the regional countries are working with the Taliban. And this is short of recognition. But the fact that in Mumbai consulate, there is an appointee by the Taliban is one step away, maybe short of formal recognition. But given the fact that most of the countries are engaging and working with the Taliban, what else should India be doing at this point of time?
Which countries would these be, Ms. D'Souza?
I think there are quite a few regional countries. For if you see in the region itself, and beyond that, you have UAE and other countries. But it's more about looking at the fact that the regional itself is changing and it's in a reflux. So India will have to, take a step which is pragmatic at one level and idealistic at the other. But it can't be idealistic in the way of shying away or shirking away from dealing with the Taliban, who are making those overtures. So I think it's a catch-22 situation for India. And India has moved in slowly. It started with the humanitarian aid, and it's looking at helping them with agriculture, education, health, and all of this. So they're gradually stepping up their presence. So the technical team, which is based in Kabul, is hardly able to get out of the camp from the embassy itself, but they're able to do some work on the humanitarian grounds. And India is also tied up with the UN agencies to distribute food and the essential supplies. So I think it's an interesting phenomena where India doesn't want to be left behind when other countries have moved ahead. And if you look at the outreach made by Russia and China, that again itself is indicative of how the region is changing. So if you ask me about the countries, I think more than 11 countries are dealing with them, and there have been constant exchange and diplomatic missions have been opened. So India doesn't want to be left behind at this point.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Before I bring you in, Kathy, I just want to go to Mr. Bhasin and say welcome, Mr. Bhasin, to the program. I'm very curious because I know that you have, you've been in conversation with. Can you unmute yourself? You've been in conversation with the Taliban too for quite some time. You've been talking to, various members of the Taliban government. How do you see this relationship between India and the Taliban? Because, intelligence agencies have now found arms and ammunition that are being used by terror groups attacking Jammu that have all come from the arms being left behind by US troops when they exited Afghanistan. That's a bit of a worry in India. Which a lot of the army guys have been telling me that has not even made it to the India Taliban table. Do you think that is something that we should address?
Of course, thank you, firstly, for giving me this opportunity. Of course, it has to be addressed, but then in general, that maybe because I don't know how those really, I'm not taking any sides, but it can be, things sold or smuggled or, taken because, when you're taking over, how do someone make inventory and secure weapons, in a country
So can I ask you, do you still see Afghanistan as a safe haven for terror groups? I mean, is it the Pakistan Army and the ISI still operating in pockets? Because the Kandahar lobby and certain elements in the Taliban still have very strong links with the Pakistanis.
So they do, and also you're right. So see, there are 20 odd terrorist groups all still operating there, right? Although as per the Doha agreement, the actual agreement says that Taliban will not allow, means not exactly, but the gist of that, what is stated in the agreement is, will not allow a terror act of terrorism on US or its allies. Okay, so firstly, US India is not a US ally. So frankly, I would not cover that. Now we, as Shanti
Oh
rightly
my.
put it, Shanti rightly put it, we have to secure our own interests and face realities and look after ourselves to a large extent, considering Pakistan's influence and our situation in Kashmir, where we just had an election and now we have a sort of a democratically elected government back in in seat.
Which is under attack every other day.
Okay, and because that I also feel, from the Indian domestic, because when you have a state machinery, when you had a central government machinery, it had more powers to, regulate the state when the power devolves to the state machinery. So the law and order situation also, goes to that, largely that responsibility, in spite of the army being there, goes down to the
But
local.
Mr. Bhasin, as Shanthie D'Souza just told us, there is a very strong link now between the Taliban and our government, which
Right.
is offered now to train, its civic agencies and so on and so forth,
Right.
basically to be able to bring some kind of school of governance, which the
Right.
Taliban is not really comfortable with and has never actually governed
Right.
Afghanistan. Is that a good thing that should we build those kind of bridges with the Taliban?
Yeah, of course we should do, because in fact, Shanti and was there when I was there. We were doing that even during the democratically elected. We had UN capacity, civil services capacity building programs, etc. Even going on then, and the presence which helps engage the Taliban and help them govern better, actually will help them have that confidence to push them to address the issues regarding women, etc. Because you need capacity in governance to address all issues, including other these social issues. So if you build capacity, I don't see any harm in, as long as whoever goes there is secure, and any harm in doing that.
Yeah, Kathy,
See,
if I could come to,
quickly, I
sorry.
look at our relations with Taliban at three broad levels. One is that strong people-to-people goodwill level, okay, and one is the state-to-state level. The state-to-state level has two ties. One is a bilateral, but one is, like Shanti put it, is that when Russia, Iran, all the countries start engaging, for India's regional and strategic interest, we could not, that would not be prudent to stay out of Afghanistan, and because our people-to-people tie goodwill is our biggest asset, according to me. So, and with the threat we face from China and Pakistan, India not being present in China and not engaging with Taliban would not have been very good for India.
In this whole business about trade that Shanthie D'Souza has written about in that article, as you written about, Shanti, you basically said that it will be Afghan businessmen would be more interested in developing ties with India. But is the reverse also true, Mr. Bhasin? I mean, in the sense you're one of the earliest entrepreneurs who entered Kabul. Would you think it's safe enough for Indian businessmen to set up new businesses and invest in Kabul and invest in Afghanistan?
So I think Indians have started to engage. The people are going down there. There are in fact a lot of Indians. Business is still slow, but business is slow for two reasons. That one is it's three factors actually. Security is a concern, but it needs to be understood of what the change situation is post takeover. The other issue is economics, because with the aid drying up, we have to also look at the opportunity in terms of how much is the size of the economy and how much is the opportunity. When you go to a country which is all facing humongous poverty and etc. So there is a lack of opportunity there. I think the opportunity largely lies in the mining sector. Okay, but there then the logistics become an issue. Although we have Chabar as a port, but it has its complications, especially with Mr. Trump back in power. We have to see how the US sanctions. Do we have although we have a carve out on Chabar for the investment, but not for the business, which has been an issue. So it's also the logistics of it. So the bottleneck is if ideally, if it was easier to bring it to Pakistan, then trade would boom because then it would be faster, easier, and secure. So I think those are the challenges of increasing engagement. And I think the largest challenge, more than security, is the economic reality of uh, Afghanistan today.
I think both go hand in hand, security and economics.
Yeah. So I think that's what it is. But I think
Yeah.
India earlier used to promote, our trade bodies to go there. I'm not sure whether we've, again started that, sort of given that more push on asking CII, FICCI and other trade bodies to, to start because Taliban, it becomes a little tricky because Taliban is not legitimate and,
Yeah.
recognized.
Yeah,
So
it's recognized only by 2 countries in the world today.
Yeah,
Kathy,
yeah.
if I can come to you, I mean, I'm curious about why the Taliban would be so, sort of lowering its defenses, so to speak, on India. I mean, what has India done to gain the Taliban's trust? I mean, is it because they haven't sort of backed the Northern Alliance and the old regime as they did earlier when they were part and parcel of that, the air base that was created, Farakor air base, and, fueled a huge arms supply to the Northern Alliance. This time, even though Ahmad Massoud has asked for help, Delhi has been very cold to the idea. And despite the Panjshir Valley being, attacked the way it has, where I believe the Taliban went from house to house looking for people, all of that has happened, and there's not been a peep out of India.
Yeah, I guess I listen and I just see the same narratives going over and over again. It happens in the US, it happens in India, it happens in Pakistan. I guess I wonder, which makes me wonder where it goes in the future, because it really is much the same narrative. When you talk about Pakistan, and no question, I'm not for a moment suggesting that Pakistan doesn't play games in Afghanistan, but so does India, so does Russia, so does China, so does the US. I mean, let's be fair.
That's right.
This is the problem in the region. Everybody niggles the other one. So
Yeah.
I think that has to at least be on the ground and on the table, rather than everybody taking this, well, this one, that one, and not for a moment. And nothing gets changed. I mean, in fairness to Pakistan, since the Taliban took power, they have lost over 1,000 security forces since they came to power, since the Taliban, both military, army, police, and whatnot. The militant groups that are there include the IMU, which is against Russia, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, includes also the Turkestan group, which is against China, and that's China's big concern, just as India's big concern is those from that Pakistan. Russia has its concerns with the IMU. So those are real issues. And the thing with Afghanistan, and I've been covering Afghanistan since the Russians were there in the late 80s. So I'm going to say this because I know everyone in the region uses Afghanistan for their own politics and enemies.
Convenient whipping boy.
Well, not even the whipping boy, but their territory on which to go after other people. The Blue Liberation Army was in Kandahar during the Karzai and during the Ashraf Ghani government. Everybody knows that. The head of the BLA blew himself up when he was trying to build a car bomb in this division outside of Kandahar. So that's very clear, so, and they have launched many attacks and gone after China. So then Pakistan says, oh, that's India. India says, oh, this is Pakistan doing this. So I just want to, and I'm not saying this to defend anyone, I'm saying it very clearly, that everybody uses the Afghan territory and those that they can use against another. And until that sort of finds a way to work itself out, it's hard to see how anyone in this region is going to make it better for the region. And everyone is right who says that, you have to worry about your concerns. India has to worry about its concerns. Pakistan has to worry about its, Russia its, China its. So at some point, there has to be a coming together that says there's no more using the territory, which none of you guys are going to be able to do anyway. So that's also very clear. So that Afghans can find a solution. India has no answers for Afghanistan. America has no answers. All this civic training over the last 20 years, who were the first people to leave in August 2021? It was the civil society. They were running to the airport. And so, yes, capacity building is absolutely important. And yes, it's very possible. And I'm just going to say one last thing. Is I was talking to someone today who's Afghan working on the ground and doing incredible work. And there's a lot of Afghans who are trying to come together. And they're talking among tribal elders, they're talking among themselves, they're talking within the Taliban, they're trying to reach the head of the Taliban, the Akhundzada, and they're trying to bring about change. But when you isolate an entire country and everybody is gone except for a few pockets here and there, then that strength among everybody it's difficult because you feel so isolated. And I'll finish this last thing because I know that these are happening inside Afghanistan. Afghans have the answers, and they are trying now to come together, including with some within the Taliban, and talking to the Taliban and writing letters, looking to have a jirga, so they're trying to find solutions that come from within Afghanistan. And if it were possible that the regional countries could find a way to assist them rather than dictate or say, well, it's against Pakistan and China, it's against India, it's against, and I'm not sure that's possible. So,
no, but that's a very good point, actually.
I'm not sure who are the two governments that recognize the Taliban, because as far as I know, nobody recognizes the Taliban. There are no governments.
China has.
I don't think China has recognized. I don't think anybody has given diplomatic recognition to, and also, if I could also say, states now do not recognize other governments. They don't recognize governments. They recognize countries. They recognize Afghanistan. The Taliban are the de facto government. And because they control 90% or 100% of the country. So they are the government. The Northern Alliance, they ran the country for 20 years, whether it was Karzai or under Ashraf Ghani. The Taliban are back. They ran the government from 92 to 96. That brought the Taliban in 96. So I don't think there's a real appetite to go back to those who were the ones who were running the government prior that
really? That's
in
very
both times. So I think there has to be some sort of understanding of Afghanistan, from within Afghanistan. When was the last time any of us were there? I mean, I was there last year. But, so everybody is talking about it, and I feel equally incapable. And when I'm talking to people in Afghanistan, because I haven't been there since last year, so do I have a right really to try to say, here's the situation, and this is but I do know that there are people working within the country, and Afghans have a real sense of what they want, and we don't need to tell anybody what they need to do. And I think mostly people will go in based on their own, whether India because of Pakistan and China, Pakistan because of India, Russia because they're worried about the IMU, and the Central Asian states all have embassies there. They all have people there. Japan has sent their deputy ambassador there. Nobody has given official recognition, diplomatic, because it's just diplomatic recognition to the Taliban. So there is a way to engage, and that's all.
So you basically you're not dissing these countries for engaging with the Taliban. That's basically what you're saying, and especially you're not being critical of these governments for engaging with the Taliban.
You don't like them, tough luck. It's their country. They're the ones who are there. They're the de facto government. You want to keep beating them over the head and say, we're not going to talk to you until you do this, this, and this.
That's
It's
right.
their country. Now, of course, the international community, and they want to engage, and you have to have discussions, but you have to talk to them. And you have to show some respect, you know, to at least have a conversation so that and also get back there so you can see all those people who are doing things, the Afghans that
Yeah,
really are working hard and
yeah,
trying to make a difference. And until you're there, you're not going to see them if you're sitting in Doha or Delhi or Islamabad,
that's
you know.
true.
So that's my last, I promise.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Nina, can I just put in a
Miss,
word on what
yes,
Kathy
yes,
said?
of course.
So she's right. It is their country, and I was in Dubai recently, and even the Afghans who have left Afghanistan, you know, who are not, politically opposed, who don't want, what we got talked about, the inclusive government and all that, who don't have a political state, but who are businessmen and others, are part of that conversation. They're already engaged, and fortunately, they are able to reach the top leadership of Afghanistan, of Taliban, and basically engage in an Afghan culturally in an Afghan way. When the West goes and puts their foot down, do this, they will never do it that way. That conversation, she rightly said, has to be internal of how
Mm.
our society has to evolve, and this is a problem, and it is accepted as a problem. It's not like stuck in stone that okay, this is done, this will never change. So that discussion
Yeah.
within the Afghans themselves.
So if I can just go back to the practical aspect of this India-Taliban outreach, what the issue on Chabahar port, I mean, very clearly it is a move by India to sort of, remove Karachi from the equation and see to it that its goods and, whatever else is it's sending to Afghanistan and out of Afghanistan goes to Chabahar. But is that really going to be a viable proposition, Mr. Souza? Because I mean, we know that there were sanctions that on India, but I mean they've looked the other way at the moment. But with Iran, being the in the sort of target of Israeli, ire, will Iran be able to, and will India and Iran be able to put together this project where we can actually have an Afghan corridor?
I think the fact that India and Iran signed the Chabahar agreement early this year is indicative of the fact that they're serious about using that route. Now, whether it is vis-a-vis the Karachi port or to reduce dependence on Pakistan, it is to be seen and the difficulty the relationship has evolved between the Taliban and the Pakistan itself. So I think it is one aspect of understanding of how Iran, despite the sanctions, and if you remember during the Trump administrations, during the first term, there was a 6-month waiver given in. And this time when India signed the agreement, it was in between this presidential elections, which was a very convenient time to start something. And now the momentum has built up. And given the fact that the American administration at this point under Trump is highly transactional, there's always a profit motive. And I think if there is a profit motive and India can convince the US and work with Iran, I think it will be feasible. But for India, what is essential is that it's just not about Pakistan. It's also about having a Connect Central Asia policy, of having route to Central Asia, which has been denied by Pakistan time and again. So as Kathy rightly pointed out, I think it's unfortunate that given the way things are evolving, Afghanistan has always been a battleground and it's been the area of zero-sum competition between the countries. But what I see is interesting and useful is that the Iranian route, particularly the Chabahar port, to tie countries in a kind of a regional cooperative framework. And gradually over time, there even talks about having the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline where the Taliban have indicated interest. So we could be looking at the region with Afghanistan as a land bridge, which could bring in greater connectivity and greater cooperation between the countries. So I think we need to frame our questions and our understanding of Afghanistan, not just as an arena of competition, but also of cooperation. So beyond what's happening with India and Taliban at the moment, there are other countries and other prospects in terms of trade, transit, and connectivity, which I think needs to be highlighted. And that's not getting adequate attention. So I would go ahead and emphasize on Kathy's point that the conversation has to be internal. It has to be inside Afghanistan. No one can really tell the Taliban what they should be doing because they are the de facto authorities. But my point is that engaging with them and dealing with them will broaden their worldview because as you do meet various Taliban officials at various forums, and you get to know that gradually they're changing their views on not many things. So a kind of socialization is occurring. They understand that women from India go abroad and study, and they should let their girl children go and study. I think it will be a generational change, but the change is occurring. So beyond what we're looking at, strategic terms, I think it's more about culture, society, and building those linkages which existed in the region between Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. So all these projects, right from Chabahar, I think we need not see it as a competitive model, but more as a cooperative model. Maybe it will trigger Pakistan to join the entire project through TAPI, and that could be one way of looking at minimizing the competition and advancing cooperation.
That's a very good point. Mr. Bhasin, if I could ask you, the whole issue of Indian businessmen being investing in Afghanistan is it very interesting. I mean, we set up the Indira Gandhi Hospital. I can't remember which year it was, which provided, limbs, and that kind of thing for children and people who
It was set up in the 70s.
yeah, so I mean, it goes so far back. What is it that is there's this now conversation about Afghan businessmen looking to get visas to visit India. What would their interest be in India? Would they be interested in investing here or tying up with businesses here? What could that be? And please tell me what you think about Chabahar. You were one of the first businessmen
No,
to visit
Chabahar,
Chabahar.
I was going to be in Chabahar was basically the American interest is more strategic. It is more in relation to a counter to Gwadar. It is not Karachi.
Oh, I see.
So it's
Okay.
the security strategic thing. So they gave a carve out, but the problem is that the carve out is for the investment, and then it is a little complicated. You to actually deal there, if you deal with the Iranian, or because they're all sanctioned, right? So IRGC runs everything. So it's complicated. It's second. So that has and actually it was given that carve out was given under Trump's administration in 2018.
That's
So
right.
yeah,
So
but it was done.
can we see
It was
it
done
happening again?
to counter Chabahar being taken over by the Chinese. Because if you remember, the Iranians had threatened to give it to the Chinese when India was stalling, because the agreement was made in 2016, and then India was moving very slowly on it, and then we picked up pace in 2018. On the India-Afghanistan trade, see, the issue is that the smaller trade is still coming through Wagah, which is dry fruits and stuff like that. Because the large trade with India, the opportunity I'm saying, because from them it is more trading, okay, and there are basically two needs for businessmen to travel here to expand that trade, and medical visas. Because medical visas is also a big traffic for India, medical tourism.
But
So
that has stalled, isn't it? Because of
yes,
the
because of
visas and the
lack of visas, because that's
yeah.
very sad. And then Saad Mohseni said this: when I meet any Afghan, that's the first thing they look at me and say, "Where is our visa?" So the point is, and actually the Pakis taunt them that where is your best friend gone? Because the point is, we used to give them, and if the visas were free, we used to give them close to 1,000 visas at times a day, and that has trickled down to. I read the latest statistics is around 300 visas given in the last 3 years. Okay, so that was shut down for whatever reasons. I will not get into that. As far as the opportunity is concerned, Chabahar becomes for a larger investments, as you said, and government needs to push, because private sector will only gather. They will need some sort of incentives and push, and to start to jumpstart the whole thing, and address issues of logistics and transportation, and that's how it will take off. And very importantly, visas becomes very important, like you said.
Yeah.
If you want to have business, then businessmen can't meet
Correct.
each other, and and with the current uncertainty in Afghanistan, Indian businesses will be reluctant to go to Afghanistan. So how do you
Yeah.
increase trade without, allowing Afghans to come to India to look at different? So the trade is
Yeah.
essentially quickly is export out of is basically agricultural products and things like
Oh.
dry fruit and hing and all, etc. from Afghanistan and some amount of mining area. Now in mining, there's a huge potential which can only be built up if these issues like the logistics, I call logistical issues like visas and all are built up, which will lead to increase in the traffic. Because right now we have only one flight of Cam Air which operates from Kabul to Delhi a week,
Yeah.
right? Which is largely cargo. So that's what it is.
So, Ms. Gannon, if I could come back to you, you knew President Hamid Karzai very well. You knew Dr. Abdullah, President Ghani, and as they say, that whole coterie, the Whiskey Boys. Does President Karzai and Dr. Abdullah, the only two who've stayed on in Kabul, do they have any say in what the Taliban does? What is their role? Would they actually push for this reactivation of ties? Are they behind it? And would that include Washington? Because I mean, the Taliban has been invited multiple times to attend many conferences in Bonn and Moscow. So do you see them driving it, or is the Taliban themselves quite keen to sort of widen their international contacts?
Yeah. First, yes, I know I've known Hamid Karzai since the 80s. So even before when the Russians were in Afghanistan and Dr. Abdullah as well as a number of the Taliban. I was the only journalist that was allowed back into Afghanistan in 2001 while the Taliban were still in power. So yes, I know all of them. I do take strong exception to calling them the Whiskey Boys. I know it's cute and fun, but Hamid Karzai doesn't drink. And I mean, I hear this. They're throwaway lines that we like to. It usually happens in the West where they throw away these lines. That. But anyway, they do engage. You have to give them credit. Dr. Abdullah did come back to India, where his family is, for Eid. Year before, I think, last year, the year before, and then returned to Afghanistan.
So did President Karzai. He was allowed to go and travel when his brother died.
President Karzai he was allowed to travel to the States and to Germany after Qayyum Karzai died, his brother. You're absolutely right. They are engaging. They do engage. They're not the only ones that are there. Hamid Kaylani is there as well, and has been there the whole time. And Fatima Gilani and all of these go back and forth. So they do engage with the Taliban. Can they change the Taliban's thinking? Or well, first, because there are very many different thoughts going on within the Taliban. Yes, Hamid, of course, is from Kandahar, and he's known some of these people for years. I mean, he's very close with he's during when the Russians were there, the Haqqanis and the Gilanis and everybody, and Hekmatyar is there still.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of these old names that are still there, and yes, they talk to the Taliban, but the real conversation that's going to have change is within the Taliban itself, and there is a lot of talk, but also people have to understand, I think anyway, is that unity is a very important thing for the Taliban. And so they will always want to appear to be unified. So even those conversations that are going on about girls' education, about engaging with the West, all of those things happen, but nobody, whether it's Mullah Brother, whether it's Yaqub, whether it's Haqqani, are going to go to the mat for and disturb the unity. And none of them, including most of the men in Afghanistan, to be very clear, are going to go to the mat for the girls. When the women have been out demonstrating, they haven't had the men, and they've often complained that the men are not out there also. So I just make that point. Yes, Karzai and that are still. Anyway, I'm finished.
Yeah, thank you very much, But I am curious, Ms. Kathy, about what you said about the Taliban leader Akhundzada scuttling plans to open schools, because I mean this is the direct move by him to scuttle I suppose, the return of US and Western embassies and diplomatic recognition, don't you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, because I was there, obviously, in 2022 when they were going to open the schools and everything was ready. I'd been to the education ministry; they had made arrangements, and Mullah Akhundzada, he changed it at the 11th hour.
Yeah.
The more the U.S., if you look at since the last 3 years, the edicts have come more and more. They've been more started targeting women because, of course, the louder the U.S. and the West cries. And it is always the US, you know, I'm Canadian. It really doesn't matter whether Ottawa jumps up and down, but, you know, the US, and the more they beat them over the head, the more it gives strength to those where isolation actually gives them the ability to do as they want. And also it weakens the others, because if you are being disrespected, if the Taliban are being disrespected in Senate hearings where they're being called names and saying they're, you know, well, you see the Taliban, they're fat and happy. I mean, these kinds of disrespectful comments only weakens those within Afghanistan and within the Taliban who really would like to see a change, not necessarily looking like America. Afghanistan is a very deeply conservative country. It doesn't,
Absolutely.
it's not America. And why should it be? You know,
Exactly.
people should be asking Afghans, what do they want and how do you reach that? Anyway, I went on a tangent, but
No, you didn't. That was perfect, actually. So, concluding remarks, Mr. Bhasin and Mr. Souza, I actually have a question, very particular question for you, Shanthie D'Souza. You know, you've called it a policy readjustment towards the Taliban. So, is New Delhi breaking ranks, so to speak, with the West by reaching out to the Taliban? Because you know, this whole I mean, the new administration that is coming in, you know, there is talk about, you know, I mean, there is a lot of talk, quoting of what Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, said. I mean, he heads the India caucus. He's advocates stronger ties with India to basically counter China, Pakistan. But he's also said we need a new partner to prevent the creation of a terrorist superstate. And he was basically aiming at India. So do you think was there some kind of a chat that India could have had with the Biden administration, as well as, you know, now the incoming Trump administration, on working towards mending fences with the Taliban or building bridges with the Taliban, so to speak?
Well, I think it's interesting that you ask this question now, because if you look at what's happened in the last 3 years, the Americans have just adopted an isolationist policy, which clearly hasn't worked. And I think for India to adopt that would have been very self-limiting. So it's not about breaking ranks, it's about being pragmatic. And if you look at how India has gone ahead with its policy, especially on Ukraine as well, it has maintained its relationship with Russia. So it's not going to just blindly follow the West, because it's looking at its interests. And as Kathy pointed out, every country is looking at its interests. So I don't think it's about just breaking the ranks, but it's become growing in your own foreign policy ideology and thinking and becoming a realist path. So when I talk about policy readjustment, the last 2 decades, I mean, there was an idealistic policy of, you know, supporting the democratic regime, which was fully understood because that was the government of the day. But today you have the de facto authorities who are controlling 100% of Afghanistan. You have to work with them. You have to deal with them. So it's
I get that. And
so when we look at the Trump administration, I'm not sure how it's going to evolve over time. But I think there is some kind of understanding which could have been worked between the previous administration and now of preventing Afghanistan from becoming the safe haven to various groups. And I think importantly, Neena, the fact that Taliban still has linkages with Al-Qaeda remains worrisome. So we have to look at that scenario as well of how Afghanistan is going to evolve over time. But at the moment, I think India needs to involve more into normalizing Afghanistan, working with Taliban and helping the Afghans in ways inside Afghanistan.
Mr. Bhasin, you know, there's a line saying, what else can India do, in Shanti's copy, which I thought was quite interesting. Do you think that this is the only way out?
Yeah, I think firstly we should stop looking at our relationship with Afghanistan through a US prism, because the Afghans perceive us very differently. I've stayed on the ground and I've spent 20 years there, right? So we, fortunately, I think that's a country where the Indians per se have immense goodwill, right, at a
Yes.
people level, and more as if we pursue our interests and policy more independently, okay, in the interest of peace and trade, because that's what we are following: capacity building, humanitarian projects, uh, and increasing trade and it's basically focused on economic. Of course, we address security issues vis-a-vis, the context of Kashmir and terrorism, but
Yeah.
ultimately our relationship has to be, because culturally and economically, the way Afghans perceive us is very different than the US, right? So we have to understand that, and I
Yeah.
think we are continuing. So we went to quickly add we exited Kabul in a hurry in August, on August 17, 2015, and because there was chaos there, so no one knew what's going to happen, and we reestablished our mission, technical mission there in I think June of 21, roughly a year after that, and we've continued.
22 actually.
2022.
We exited in
Yeah.
August
And
17,
GP Singh,
2021.
fortunately, because also in the bureaucracy, if you have the same person going, he understands the context. JP Singh was there. It was in Kabul in I think 2007, around 2007-8, in that period, and then has been in
That's right.
Pakistan, and then has been JS Spy. So there is a continuity in policy, because you have a person who's the point man, who's basically understands the different, firstly makes a person. It's very important with the Afghans to have that personal trust. So you have the same person going, that
Yeah.
people, person to person, is very important. Plus, he understands the different context as far as India's engagement with the Taliban is concerned, and his continuity has helped take the gradually, but take the relationship and keep it in our interest. That's what I would say.
Anyway, we'll wait and see whether India actually formally now recognizes the
I
Islamic
doubt
Emirate of Afghanistan.
no one will. I can tell you
I also don't think so, but
till
it's
the
something which
US,
is being
I'll tell
talked
you,
about.
till the US
We
recognizes
don't have enough. I'm running out of time, Sam.
quickly, I'll tell you, even Russia, China, no one has. They've done some, like Kathy said, it's a diplomatic thing. They accepted that.
Yeah.
That is just a de facto thing. Formally, no one has recognized them. It's too complex, with still some of the people being on FBI's and UN's blacklist.
Wanted list.
Russia is talking about, hasn't removed. Russia is even talking of removing them from the blacklist. So
Oh
the
my
point is,
gosh.
you should also understand, I don't want to say it more openly, you engage and you keep them at where they are, but you don't need to give more till you need to. And that will never happen till the US does that. If
Anyway, all I
US
can say is India is taking a giant leap of faith. One can only hope we land on our feet, that we land on solid ground. Thank you very much, Ms. Shanthie D'Souza, Ms. Kathy Gannon, Mr. Saad Mohseni, and Mr. Sumeer Bhasin for coming on the show. Viewers, please click on the New Indian Express website and the Global Express icon to watch and share.